Particularly, this is an empty project from Visual Studio.NET 2003. Now, what you have here is the ability to work with many different namespaces here. By default, a lot come in because most likely you're going to be using these. This is, of course, for your forms. Normally, you're working with the data. So this is ADO.NET or whatever you want to do within system.data. We're working with components. We're going to need the component model to manage that, as well as collections. And collections help with things. You can have controls in collections, and your controls are going to be the visual things that you can add to your form, and the components can be things that you can write third party or you can add to your form as well, but they're not going to be visual, and they're a different thing. And then drawing, if you need to move any controls around, you're going to be referencing that system.drawing, and that's going to manipulate the layout of how you work with the form. So that's why you would need that. When you do any movement or changing those properties, that's when you're going to work with system.drawing, as we're going to see. So this adds a lot by default, but not really a big deal, nothing that's going to be confusing. As you move forward, it's just going to be a standard thing to have that stuff up there. Then we have a normal empty project, and we continue down. We have our form deriving from a form. Again, you could have the thing written out there to system.windows.forms.form if you wanted to. This is just going to handle our components. You can see the component model. This is going to allow us to work with components within this code here. When you work with your constructor, Visual Studio is going to actually work with an initialize component method here that's going to be placed later on. And anything that you want to do actually within your constructor, you're going to place after that, because this is going to initialize your components, your controls and components onto the form that you're working with. And it's best to do that after that's already been initialized if you need to change anything. And you need to leave that alone as well, the initialize component method that shows up later, because what Visual Studio.NET does is it does its own thing within that particular folder, and you really want to leave it alone because it could override whatever changes you make there. So it's best and safe to do that to the outside. And then we just have our override of the dispose again. This is just showing you a message box to show you that when this is going to be called, it's going to pop up. That's it. No big deal. And then we're disposing of the components if we are actually disposing. So disposing here, as you can see, is a Boolean. So if true is passed, we're disposing, and we're going to get rid of our components if that disposing is true. And that only happens when our components is not equal to null, because you're not really going to call it dispose if it's null. So that Boolean gets passed through. And if you're passing in true, then you're going to check to see if you can dispose of the components. Otherwise, you're just going to call the base.dispose and just pass along that true or false value. Either way, you're going to do this at the end. Now this region information, this is what Visual Studio.NET puts in for itself. And this is just going to put a region here so that it can control what's in here within the code. You can see it's Windows Form Designer generated code. And the Form Designer is how you lay things out visually. And that's going to work to manipulate this particular area here. So this is going to get written automatically, as you can see. And this is what's going to happen. We're going to initialize our variable components, which is dealing with our form. We're also going to make the size of the window to be a particular size. We'll make this a little bit more video-like, 4x3. And then the text of the form is going to also change. This is for the form itself. Size of the form and the text of the form. And notice that components is up here. This is that variable that we create that's going to hold any components. And it does that by default in the beginning, just to set things up. All within the region information. So we can save this. Don't really want to mess with that, but at the same time I just changed it, so you can never guarantee what's going to happen there. You could fool around with the code here and then work within Visual Studio to see what happens. But when I just move that and I'm not currently in Visual Studio or in that project, then it's going to not have an effect. When it comes in, it's going to be okay. But we also have a form1.resource file, RESX file, and this is going to be present for your different forms that you're going to have. It also controls your resources. So this is going to be necessary just to manipulate your forms and store information that Visual Studio is going to manipulate. And just to let you know that this is what you're going to get. It is human readable because it's in XML, so it does have its advanced uses, and that's for another day. But at the same time, that's what that file is. I did explain that in the very beginnings. So this is our project. for the Form 1. We'll compile that in Visual Studio. And then I have a handwritten one here that we'll talk about coming up. But you can see that this is not going to work with that initialized component, but yet it's still going to manipulate the components and controls in the starting constructor, in the constructor for the form. You just don't see that other method there. It's just a method within that. So it's just a way of managing that. And it works similarly, except it has a couple more controls there. And we don't have all the extra controls there. So we'll go into Visual Studio, and we're going to open up our project, not the Windows application, but we're going to open up that empty project. And we'll just build this and show you what it looks like. So you notice that this is a 4x3 size here, 400 by 300. And it just pops up and everything's okay. Just like usual, except we're not using that default size. And you can manipulate as you want to, just an empty form. And when we dispose, when we try to close it, we see that that message box I talked about gets called, and it's saying disposed. And then everything closes. So in the code here, because we can view the code there for that CS file, you can see it looks very similar to what we were doing with the primal code script view, except this region is collapsible and it's hidden, so it's not there. You're like, wait, where is it? I can't find it. Well, it's there. That's Window Form Designer generated code. It's closed because Visual Studio wants you to leave it alone. And there you see we have that 400 by 300. If we made it square, change it to 400, there, the form is updated there. So you can manipulate it, but it just depends. You have to be careful. A minimum Windows application.